Okay, perfect. So, good morning or good afternoon or wherever you are, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar about science diplomacy, which we think is something that is really important nowadays and more than ever. So I ask kindly Dr. James Kirkham to present this because we have been collaborating for many years now at COPs and at the Chrysler Pavilion, and we are also friends actually. And so we definitely wanted to share this experience with you, as actually it's really interesting. So James actually now is related to the International Chrysler Climate Initiative, and actually is it's a glaciologist, of course, who has been working a lot on Antarctica, in Nepal, also on the mountain glaciers. And actually now through ICCI, he provides a lot of scientific advice, and especially to this declaration that is called Ambition on Melting Ice, high-level groups, and that countries join, and that happens regularly at COPs and meets also outside COPs, actually, to really discuss how to maintain the pressure on raising awareness and policies on mitigations to preserve the cryosphere, actually. So James regularly attends a lot of policy events and COPs, of course, and United Nations conferences that happens also outside of the COPs, and try to raise the visibility about the importance of protecting the cryosphere. So I hope this webinar will really open some new horizon to you if you don't know anything about science diplomacy. And so I'm very happy that James will now speak about it. So James, it's all yours now.
Super. Thanks so much, Flo, for that introduction. And I'll start also by saying thank you very much to SCAR for the opportunity to present about this topic today. And thank you to all of you who've come to listen to this talk. So I hope it's a useful experience for you as well. So this talk is, as Flo said, all about climate science diplomacy. And I plan to talk you through what this actually is, how to do it, so how do you effectively communicate with policymakers, and why we need to convince them to care about ice at this critical juncture for climate action. So I'll be speaking about this topic from our perspective as the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, which is an NGO that tries to bridge the gap between cryosphere science and the policy sector, particularly within the UN negotiation space. And our organization is composed of a mixture of scientists and former diplomats that uses the science to lobby for greater ambition regarding the need for country emission reduction targets and ambition within this process. So this talk is going to be a lot about these three letters. And when I give this talk in person, I usually start by asking for a show of hands about who's actually been to a COP. And then I ask people to keep their hands up if they've actually followed the negotiations. And what this exercise normally shows is that most scientists have never been to a COP. And the very thought of this annual meeting conjures up images of people in suits talking about very technical agreements, world leaders making grand speeches, protesters saying they're not doing enough, and of course, lots and lots of private planes and jets. But at its heart, COP is the place where countries come together to negotiate how to limit dangerous human-caused climate change. And so regardless of what you think of this forum, this is the forum we have. So it's really important to engage with it if we want our voice to be heard. Now, for a bit of history, so COPs have been going on for over 3 decades now, starting in 1992, where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, was first designed. 5 years later, in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was signed that gave developed countries targets to reduce their emissions for the first time ever. Fast forwarding now to 2009 in Copenhagen, where progress was made in the global acceptance of the need to limit warming to below 2 degrees, but a much more ambitious deal collapsed at the last minute, leading to generally negative perceptions of this particular COP that still linger on today. No one wants their COP to be like Copenhagen. Now, it took 21 COPs to get the Paris Agreement, which for the first time ever says that all countries will have climate targets to keep the world well below 2 degrees, with this striving aim to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, the Paris Agreement is so significant because it operates something called the ratchet mechanism, where each country has to submit targets on a 5-year cycle, and each of those has to be progressively more ambitious than the last set of targets. And between these ratchets, we have something called a global stocktake, which are then set between these to assess progress. And last year was one of these ratchet years where 2025 new countries pledged their new climate pledges for 2030 to 2035. Now, the first of these global stocktakes was conducted 2 years ago at COP28 in Dubai. And for the first time ever, and this is COP28, the need to transition away from fossil fuels was stated explicitly in the outcome. Now, this is certainly historic, but whether that's in a positive or a negative sense is a bit down to your opinion on this matter. Now, there are many ways to participate in a COP, and numbers have indeed ballooned in recent years. So traditionally, about 5 to 10,000 people attended each year, but a new record was then broken at COP28 when over 80,000 people attended Dubai, and we had over 50,000 in the last 2 years. There's different ways to participate, which gives you a different badge, and the increase you see in recent years is mostly due to what's called overflow or other badges, although the number of observers have also grown a little bit too. Now, in Dubai, we had over 2,000 fossil fuel lobbyists attending the COP, either to make business deals on the side or keep an eye on the negotiations. And we saw similar numbers also in Baku, and the numbers are still being worked out for last year in Belém too. So, how does it actually work? So a large part of the work is, of course, an ongoing process, and a lot of the preparation for a COP actually happens in Bonn in June the same year, working through these sort of working level meetings of country negotiators. And these meetings lay the groundwork for a number of different negotiating texts that are then to be negotiated and finalized in the COP meeting later that year. So some of these include mitigation, so how do we reduce our emissions, adaptation, and of course, loss and damage. So how do we compensate countries for climate damage and climate impacts that cannot be adapted to? Then come November or December, tens of thousands of delegates then converge on a place like this to meet for 2 weeks for a COP. So this is the Baku Stadium at COP29. And there are different areas of this space, as you can see in these different buildings that are set aside for the negotiations, side events, the press, the public plenary, and of course, pavilions too. Now, the first 2 days of a COP typically start with a leaders' summit, and many, many speeches are, of course, made. And there are some incredibly passionate characters here. So I'm going to play you a clip of one that caught my attention from COP29. And this was a really emotional message from Simon Steele, the UNFCCC Executive Secretary. Now, he's from Grenada, which had just a few months earlier been completely devastated by Hurricane Beryl, the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record. Let's hear what he had to say.
The lady I'm standing with, this picture, is my neighbor Florence in Kirkham. In July this year, this was us standing in all that remained of her home after the devastation of Hurricane Beryl. At 85, Florence has become one of the millions of victims of runaway climate change this year alone. She was focused on one thing: being strong for her family and strong for her community. And there are people like Florence in every country on earth, knocked down and getting back up again.
Now, I've seen a lot of Simon's speeches over the years, but this was the first time that I've actually seen him choke up whilst giving a speech. So a real sense of urgency here that the impacts are really escalating and having these really personal impacts on the key players in these negotiations. Now, others are frankly less inspiring. So in the same opening session, we had the president of Azerbaijan, the COP29 host, who used his speech instead to double down on his oil is a gift from God comment and attack the media and civil society.
I said it several months ago, and now all those who want, international media to attack me, just quote me that I said that this is a gift of the God, and I want to repeat it today here at this audience. It's a gift of the God. Every natural resource, whether it's oil, gas, wind, sun, gold, silver, copper, all that are natural resources. And countries should not be blamed for having them and should not be blamed for bringing these resources to the market because the market needs them. The people need them. So this is my message. And as the president of COP29, of course, we will be a strong advocate for green transition, and we're doing it. But at the same time, we must be realistic.
So the contrast between these two speeches really shows the diverse and challenging geopolitical landscape that this forum has to operate in a way that represents the global interest, but also manages to maintain sovereign and national interests at the national level too. So whilst all this is going on, country negotiators are starting the difficult task of actually conducting these climate negotiations. And they tend to meet in these big square rooms, often without any windows, with screens to view the text and microphones to speak in. And at the back of this image here, you can see chairs where the observers can watch what's happening. Now, countries don't generally negotiate as individual countries, but rather in larger blocks or groupings to give them more weight. And as you can see by this image, it's extremely complex. Countries can be part of multiple groups and sometimes even use this configuration to strengthen an agreed negotiating position or point. So they might move into a different block and support their ally in terms of getting the seconding or supporting the statement they want to strengthen. Now, statements are generally made by what's called raising a flag of the country, which is this little paper placard with their country's name on it, and then waiting to be called by the chair of the meeting. Countries then give comments to the chairs about the text being discussed, and then the chairs have the responsibility to collate those comments, go away, redraft the text accordingly in a balanced way that represents all views. And if countries cannot agree about a particular point, they often leave that formal setting of those square tables to form a huddle to find a way forward. And this is often to find a particular workaround about a particular sticking point in the language or a particular term. And for those of us, we're polar scientists, right? So often it reminds me, at least, of our friends in the southern continent there. So elsewhere, there is a pavilion space where both countries and civil society can have pavilions. And to many, this feels like a completely surreal trade show. So some use it to show off their country, highlight what their country is doing to address climate change. Others use it to provide relevant information to the COP. And often you get high-level visitors, head of state government, ministers coming to visit, learning more and taking some photos there as well. Now, towards the middle of week 2, ministers show up to resolve sticking points that are beyond the remit of those working level negotiators. And these often occur through high level bilateral meetings or meetings in larger groups. And then if we're lucky, we have a decision. And decisions at COPs are made by consensus. And this term is generally taken to mean that there can be no stated objections to a proposed decision. So unless countries formally raise their flag and say, we object to this deal in the closing plenary, the deal generally stands. But over the years, countless decisions have been abandoned, watered down, or deferred to the next negotiating session because of a very small handful of objections. So is it working? Well, things are still getting worse. However, we're no longer heading for 4 degrees of warming by 2100, which is a considerable achievement. That being said, as you can see, we're still very, very far away from where we need to be. The Paris Agreement is, of course, working, and the projected new round of emissions pledges are bending the curve down to compare to the projections before that Paris Agreement. But we remain wildly off track to meet the 2-degree Paris limit, let alone 1.5 degrees, although reaching over 3 degrees is looking increasingly unlikely. So how do we operate as an organization bridging cryosphere science to policy in this complex environment? Well, on the more academic side, we publish a peer-reviewed annual report called The State of the Cryosphere each year that is written for a policy negotiator audience using their language. And this provides a basis of information presented in a way that the negotiators can really understand. We also work closely with a network of journalists to raise awareness of these issues and their policy relevance, particularly at or around these key events. At the COPs, we then run the Cryosphere Pavilion, which is now a well-recognized space. It's been going on for the last 6 years, dedicated to raising what's at stake in the negotiations from a cryosphere perspective. We tend to run about 60 side events in this space over the course of the 2-week COP, where the latest cryosphere science can be presented over the course of the COP alongside covering negotiations. We also run campaigns like this one, which was launched ahead of COP28 to highlight the growing consensus within the cryosphere community that 2 degrees would simply be too high to prevent massive global impacts from the cryosphere. And this was signed by over 1,000 cryosphere scientists, including probably many of you and many IPCC authors. And this really acted as a lever that we could deploy to counter a pushback against highlighting the importance of 1.5 degrees experienced in the closing stages of that COP. But the bulk of our work is actually with the country level negotiators responsible for drafting and negotiating the key text of climate agreements, as well as those at the very highest level, both ministers and sometimes head of state government. One of the ways that we do this is through a group called the Ambition on Melting Ice high-level group on sea level rise and mountain water resources, which is a ministerial level coalition of governments that was founded at COP27 by the nations of Chile and Iceland. And ICCI serves as the secretariat of this group. The idea of this group is not just to be countries that contain ice, but is actually open and especially encourages membership from countries that are affected by ice loss, either through changes to, for example, downstream water resources or sea level rise. And as you can see, we're now 25 countries and the group is growing. And we really include a really good cross-representation of various negotiating blocks. So meetings of this Ambition on Melting Ice group can be very fruitful in terms of outcomes that touch on both the UN climate negotiations and needed climate ambition in this decade of critical action. As Flo mentioned, the Ambition on Melting Ice high-level group has a declaration that stresses the importance of averting impacts of cryosphere loss for the whole world, not just nations that contain ice. And the aim is really to raise ambition of mitigation efforts by raising the collective concern of many nations about these issues. We have these AMI meetings twice a year where we can bring climate negotiators and cryosphere scientists together to discuss the latest science and how scientific findings can feed through into negotiation strategy. And these meetings sometimes even include a field trip where we can take the negotiators to establish these personal links and memories about the cryosphere to themselves. The AMI group of negotiators often requests tailored talking points that link cryosphere science to different negotiation tracks whilst the negotiations are actually going on. And these are a few examples of the language we proposed during the negotiations in Bonn last year, linking the loss of cryosphere to irreversibility, to global impact, and the need for ambition to deliver deep, rapid, and sustained emissions reductions to safeguard and limit the damage that cryosphere will do to the global community. So how do you communicate with policymakers effectively? So I wanted to share a few lessons that I've learned personally whilst doing this job, as well as some of the challenges over the last few years. So the first thing is to really know your audience. It's not just enough to say, oh yes, ice is melting in Greenland. Most people will never, ever go to an ice sheet or a glacier. They think these places are remote, out of sight, and out of mind. So in order to make it relevant for your audience, you have to help them understand the impact that, for example, Greenland will have on their country on their communities, on their daily lives. And one way to do this is to align their message with their existing values, so make it local to them, frame climate change as a matter of health or economics or national security, and this can help to appeal to people who are not engaged with environmental concerns but care deeply about other areas. And there's a whole host of different ways you can link these together. Another tip is to use really good graphics. So you've got to remember that policymakers are generally not scientists, and so reading complex graphs can sometimes be quite difficult. So using animations like this can give a really powerful yet concise message when you can take time to explain them in detail. And don't feel pressured to always use graphs. Like these summary figures are from 2 Nature and Science papers published last year, and they're classic examples of this. So scientifically, they're absolutely brilliant figures. They show just so much information in one image, a brilliant summary of the research. But to a policymaker, these figures are completely overwhelming and probably incomprehensible. They just get lost in all this detail. So in cases like this, it could be best to present findings as numbers or even a table, especially if you can animate it to focus on the key information whenever you like. And we actually brought the lead author of this study to Bonn with us last year to present at a high-level research dialogue. And I can tell you that almost all of the photos that the negotiators took of this presentation were mostly of this summary table. Now, this may seem also obvious, but you'd be surprised by the number of times that we've brought scientists to address policymakers and they've been dressed like they're going to EGU. And unfortunately, if you don't dress appropriately, many policymakers won't take you seriously. And indeed, those of us in civil society sometimes need to almost outdress to the negotiators to really effectively get our message across. And one final tip here is try to end with a message of hope that really empowers people. Very often when I speak about climate change and the outlook for the cryosphere, the reaction I get is, well, that's depressing, but what can I do about it? And this is something that studies consistently show that the majority of people are concerned about climate change, but most don't know how to make a difference at an individual level. And it's really important to remember here that hope inspires more action than fear does. And so it's really important, therefore, that when we speak, we have to connect the head to the heart to the hands. We have to link knowledge and emotional concerns with concrete actions that people can take to really make a difference. And so for policymakers, this might be in relation to a particular decision or a particular vote or regulation. For the general public, it could be how you vote, local actions you can take, how you talk to friends and neighbours, taking sustainable transport habits or reducing waste. And for the private sector, you can talk about where to invest, where to divest. We can't afford missed opportunities here. Every time you write an article, speak to the media, engage with varied audiences, we have to share a shared call to action. Now on to some common challenges. Timescales can be really difficult to pitch in our field because many of the largest numbers are decades to centuries away, far from the election timescales that many politicians think about. So here one tip is to use emotions and stories to effect. And I think this graphic is brilliant from the IPCC, and it's showing that a child born today will live beyond 2100. And so if you have a young child or a nephew or a niece, talk about them. Establish that emotional connection, that responsibility of the choices being made today, setting the world in which those children will grow up to live in the future. Another way is also to point out that the cost of inaction will vastly outweigh the cost of acting now, as another way to approach this. Another common challenge is how to deal with uncertainties. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with talking about uncertainties when talking to policymakers. In fact, it's a part of being a credible and responsible scientist. However, dealing with uncertainty can be challenging in this area because it's often misinterpreted as ignorance. So to do this, you can frame uncertainties as potential risks or unknowns as one way to address this. And it's also really important to conclude with not to conclude with what we do not know. So if you want to talk about uncertainties, talk about it in the middle of your pitch rather than at the end, which is a bit of a difference from how we often talk about it in academic settings, about in terms of what we need to do for future research. So don't end with what we don't know, try to end with a clear and consistent message. Now, an emerging challenge those of us have been observing in the climate negotiation space in the last 12 months or so is what has been called out as a pushback on science. So this is one example of text on research and systematic observation at the Bonn climate meetings last year. which is usually one of the least contentious negotiation tracks. And this pushback played out in the negotiation of this text, with multiple specific examples of science and urgency being cut from the original text over the course of these 2-week negotiations. So for some examples, we went from noted with alarm and utmost concern the state of the climate system to change to just noted the information. We had specific examples of climate extremes, including record glacier mass loss, being vaguely referred to as both slow onset and extreme events. And we moved from every increment of warming massing to just global warming. But perhaps the hardest thought of all was the narrative about 1.5 degrees, with the statement about the current temperature level eventually being relegated to a footnote. And so many countries complained about this pushback on facts and science in the closing plenary, but what to do about this does remain a really open question. So what actually happened at COP30 in Brazil in November last year? So as I said earlier, 2025 was a critical year because it was when the next round of nationally determined contributions was due at COP30. And these NDCs will set the course of ambition or emissions for 2030 to 2035 and should also update existing policy targets from now to 2030. So around 50,000 delegates descended into Belém, and they've now experienced what life on the equator is really like. So it's a world where days hit over 30 degrees, humidity is over 80%. We have torrential downpours that wash away livelihoods and flood roads, and poor infrastructure that leads to jammed, polluted cities. So Brazil really brought climate negotiators to the climate front line to experience what was happening there. The conference started with President Lula calling for national roadmaps to end deforestation and transition off fossil fuels. The plan to achieve this was through a global mutirão, a self-organized effort coming from indigenous communities to support one another in times of need. Now, conditions were challenging, to say the least. We had indoor rain, Pacific Island pavilions being closed because of flooding, and of course, a fire that many of you probably heard about. Here's a video about how it started.
Something's just started to burn.
Now, luckily, the UN security staff were extremely efficient and quick at putting out fire, and none was injured. It took them just 6 minutes, but it was really kind of symbolic in the last few days when people were talking about, what is actually happening to multilateralism. Luckily, none was injured. Another thing which happened at COP30 was the return of open protest to a COP, which was a really good thing to see again after 3 years of COPs being hosted in countries with autocratic governments where protest was heavily restricted. So one example of this was early on in the conference, we had a large group of indigenous protesters blocking the entrance of the venue, demanding to speak to President Lula about the destruction of their forest and rivers by industry. Now, President Lula was not there at the time, so instead they got COP30 President Delago, who led them away for 3 hours of talks. So definitely an improvement over the last few years in terms of indigenous voices and how they could be heard. Progress was also made in terms of agreeing what's called a just transition mechanism, so policies that support the protection of workers and communities as countries shift to clean energy and a climate resilient future. And a 2-year plan on climate finance and the commitment to triple adaptation cash by 2035 was also delivered after being long overdue, given that many African and other climate vulnerable nations are currently losing about 10% of their GDP every year to the impacts of climate change. COP30 was also the first COP ever to reference the word overshoot, so doing so through the need to keep overshoot as short and as low as possible in context to 1.5 degrees. But this was also a historic thing that happened at COP30. And again, we had a mistreatment of science. So again, under this track, research and systematic observations, parties this time could not agree to recognize that the IPCC, representing the best available science to inform the negotiations. And so several countries lamented this fact in the closing plenary. On the subject more specific to us, in terms of the cryosphere, we had really strong references initially to cryosphere and glacier loss that were eventually relegated to a footnote, although even this is actually an improvement compared to COP29. And a few of the cryosphere scientists, including myself and Flo, who witnessed this in Belém, later wrote a conversation piece about the mistreatment of cryosphere science within this process. So check out this article if you want some more details about this. So on the final day of the COP, in the closing plenary, it became marred with drama when the decision about mitigating emissions was gabbled through, whilst objections were still being raised by Colombia over the fact that fossil fuels were not referenced in the outcome. And this led to a really last-minute scramble in the closing plenary, and the outcome of this is that the decisions eventually will proceed after several hours of consulting with lawyers, but may face legal challenges further down the line. And ultimately, those roadmaps that President Lula was trying to propose at the beginning of the COP could not be achieved within the UNFCCC process, but the Brazilian presidency did launch an initiative to take those two roadmaps outside of the UN process, backed by about 90 countries. And so Belém saw signs that these talks may actually accelerate in other venues. And indeed, just a few days ago, the COP30 president published a letter reflecting on the climate diplomacy limitations that played out at COP30 and suggesting that a new two-speed system might be needed, whereby new coalitions of willing actors can lead fast, practical action alongside the slower consensus-based decision-making of the UN. Now, achievements for the cryosphere at COP30 were perhaps more heartening. So for the 6th year now, ICCI hosted the Cryosphere Pavilion along with the nations of Chile and Iceland, where the importance and latest scientific developments about the cryosphere were presented to policymakers. And over the course of those 2 weeks, the pavilion hosted about 40 different cryosphere-related events with speakers ranging all the way from Arctic, polar and mountain researchers to indigenous peoples, youth, and climate negotiators and policy experts, all of whom brought the urgency of the need to mitigate fossil fuel emissions at the very forefront of climate action here, referencing the need to limit global impacts from continued cryosphere loss. ICCI also continued our annual COP Early Career Scientist program. We brought 8 early career polar scientists to COP30 to share their research and their voice with the policymakers there. Half of our early career scientists this year were from South America, and they did just an incredible job and a real tribute to our community. So they got considerable exposure. A couple of highlights you can see here were presenting their science to a climate minister from Fiji. And one of our early career scientists also read the closing statement for the research and independent NGO group during the COP30 closing plenary. So some really nice exposure for the early career scientists on this program too. And as Flo said, they're trying to organize these guys to come along and give a similar webinar to SCAR in a couple of weeks' time. So after the experience in the research negotiation track, we also conducted an official UN side event highlighting the perils of ignoring science. And this event summarized the latest projections for glacier loss, the importance of co-producing knowledge with indigenous peoples, and the persistent gap between scientific evidence and political action within these forums. The event also highlighted feasible pathways for achieving 1.5 degrees whilst keeping overshoot as short and low as possible, following some high-profile research released by Climate Analytics and the Potsdam Institute during the COP, critical for preserving as much of the cryosphere as possible. And in its capacity as the Secretariat of the Ambition on Melting Ice High-Level Group, ICCI also coordinating an AMI ministerial meeting on November 18th, which was opened by Iceland's Minister of Environment, and also the COP29 President Mukta Babayev also opened the meeting. And in this roundtable, we had high-level statements coming from Chile, Senegal, Nepal, Liberia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Georgia, and Monaco and Fiji, with Ambition on Melting Ice releasing a statement as a joint group underscoring the urgency to remain within 1.5 degrees in order to preserve the cryosphere. Now I'm going to end with looking ahead for 2026, where here are some opportunities that we see as forum where cryosphere science can really get engaged with policy. So in March, there'll be a 2-day event at UNESCO headquarters in Paris celebrating the World Day for Glaciers. And this will mark the closing of last year's International Year of Glacier Preservation and the technical launch of the Decade of Action for Cryospheric Sciences. The aim here is to ensure that the momentum created during the International Year last year is carried forward into a sustained global effort for the next decade. In April, Colombia will host the first international conference on the phase out of fossil fuels, and this is one of those initiatives occurring alongside the UN process to create a roadmap for ending fossil fuels and offering steps to ensure a just and equitable transition. We've also offered to organise an Ambition on Melting Ice session at this conference too, on the need to limit overshoot and the need for urgency. In May, there'll be the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings in Hiroshima, Japan. And then in June, there'll be the annual UNFCCC Intersessionals, SP64, and this will include a second mountain technical dialogue, which has scope to include some aspect of the mountain cryosphere. And in September, there'll be New York Climate Week. And then, of course, there'll be COP31 in Turkey in November. So we've got a lot of lessons and experienced many challenges during this particular journey. So I'll summarize just a few key ones here. So clarity of your message is key. Focus on how the issue affects them and the things your audience cares about. Having personal connections within the process is really useful. And if you can find champions to raise these issues, it can be a really important boost in visibility. Trying to provide a message of hope and concrete steps that individuals can follow to make a difference. And this is much more powerful than a message of fear. And sustained effort really does pay off. In terms of challenges, keeping the attention of those in the highest positions can be really difficult due to the wide portfolio of issues they must cover. And of course, we have turnover of staff within administrations, and this often means having to re-educate or reinvent the wheel frequently. Of course, the world is messier than ever right now, so keeping attention on climate in a crowded space is also really difficult. And of course, communicating new emerging science while still maintaining your integrity and your trust, such as, for example, the recent changes in Antarctic sea ice in recent years, can be really challenging. So I want to end by saying this earnestly, and that is thank you. Thank you all for the work that you do. The research that you're doing is crucial to inform policymakers. The data that you provide is essential for convincing them to act. We live in a difficult world right now, and I know, and I truly know this, that the gap between what the science is saying and the speed that policy is acting can be a really difficult pill to swallow. But we're in a critical moment right now where we can make a true difference if we pull together and fight harder than ever. For the cryosphere, every 1/10 of a degree of warming matters. So every fraction of warming that can be avoided saves ice, lessens impacts, and makes adaptation possible for hundreds of millions of people around the world. We need to fight for every 1/10 of a degree. With that, I'll say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to some questions and some discussions. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks, James. I think it has been very exhaustive. It was great. So does anyone has any question to James? Well, how many now you have been to many COPs? I mean, so which one do you prefer in terms of science communication efficiency, and which one do you think it was the worst?
Good questions. I think in terms of where the message of the cryosphere really began to break through was probably at COP26 and COP27. So COP26 in Glasgow was the first time that the word cryosphere ever made it into a COP decision. But it only occurred in the preamble. So in a COP, the really important text is the operational text of these agreements. And that's what we managed to break through in terms of COP27. So we managed to get cryosphere language included in a section called science and urgency. So that was really good. I think one of the most difficult ones is probably COP29 in Baku, because there it was very much focused on finance, and that understandably really permeated every aspect of the negotiations. And so I think that it was very difficult to really push back on the importance of science. And I think it's only going to get more interesting in terms of challenges to communicate as we get closer to exceeding a long-term temperature of 1.5 degrees and get into more of an overshoot territory. I think the dynamics about communicating about that and the impacts of this can be really key to get right.
So, I mean, talking about the cryosphere and Baku, because I agree with you. Baku was probably the worst. Of the series, because I also started in Glasgow, so I agree with you on that. But talking about the cryosphere, how do you convince a country like Azerbaijan that produces oil, and probably most of the incomes is definitely oil for this country, to take care about this 1.5 degrees when you just release messages about the cryosphere, as they do not have the issue about sea level rise or this kind of thing. So how do you, in this context, deliver an efficient message?
Yeah, so again, it's all about knowing your audience. And so we did some outreach to the Azerbaijan presidency actually ahead of COP29. And there we were looking mostly at water. So for them, especially snowpack melt, also a bit of glacier melt, is really key in terms of sustaining their agriculture within their country. And so prior to the COP, we managed to get links to water from snowmelt included in one of the action agenda documents on water, by liaising myself in Bonn with the liaison officer for Azerbaijan there. So that was a success, I'd say. Then at the COP, it was more difficult because, by the time you get to COP, it can be very difficult to influence the negotiation unless you're really working closely with the countries. But as you say, it's really our angle is not so much about just preserving the cryosphere, it's limiting the global impacts of cryosphere loss in terms of both water security, it might be sea level rise, it might be the emissions that get locked in by continued permafrost thaw, or the global feedbacks that occur from sea ice loss. And so having this broader message is really important. And a continued difficulty the challenge that we're facing is really to move global awareness and policy circles away from the kind of siloed understanding that cryosphere is something which is happening there, but doesn't affect everyone, which is not true because there are so many important global impacts of cryosphere loss. And so that's really a message that we're trying to push continually through the Ambition of Melting Ice group as well.
Okay. And so just to continue on this line, so there is a huge turnover on the delegations that just reach out to COPs. So how do you transfer the message while the delegation teams are changing so frequently? So how can you ensure that the message is conveyed on a continuous way, consistently?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to have continuity. So as I mentioned, we have these meetings about twice a year where we bring climate negotiators together with scientists to learn about the latest science and try and strategize about how we can make this relevant to the negotiation. And I think often, if there is capacity, we'll try and bring at least a couple of people from each country along to learn about this, so there can be continuity. But yeah, it's a major challenge, and so it's just keeping track of what's going on. Also, it can be very difficult with ministers and higher level too, because obviously governments change. In the last few years, we've seen an extremely turbulent political period, which has involved a huge turnover of administrations and governments. And so it's definitely been a lot of work, kind of reinventing the wheel here and keeping focus on continuity if possible.
I see Megan has a question. Please.
Hi. Yeah, you can hear me. I'll try to get a video.
Yeah,
There
sure.
it is. Great. Yeah, thank you. I think also picking up on something you just discussed, you mentioned sea ice really briefly before we talked now about the turnover. And I'm wondering when we talk about the cryosphere, it's like easy to make these connections with glacial loss because of freshwater agriculture, this and that. But what connections do you draw for sea ice losses when you're talking to politicians?
Yeah. So thanks for the question. We do a few things. So we talk about the role of the sea ice as kind of a reflective shield for the Earth's energy, for example. So we often say that, if you lost sea ice in the Arctic, it'd be like putting a radiator next to the Greenland ice sheet, for example. So it's a way to amplify the changes in terms of permafrost thaw. It might be increased ice sheet melt, for example. There's also some links, and I think an increasing body of literature towards extreme weather events, especially affecting Europe, for example, from sea ice loss, and that's still being established, but very powerful. We do talk about, for example, impacts on ecosystems. So ecosystems that have evolved with a kind of a ceiling of sea ice over themselves and having these really unique ecosystems threatened by the loss of sea ice as well. And also bigger mammals, for example, polar bears too. But we try and keep focus on a lot more of the kind of economic impacts as well. And looking forward into the future, for example, the interest around the Arctic in terms of geopolitics right now is a really way to highlight that sea ice loss will make a lot of these tensions probably worse, because as you warm polar oceans lose sea ice, fish stocks will migrate northwards into cooler waters, which would then decrease that space that countries can be competing over for fisheries too. So all of these things can be really powerful, and there are countries, for example, like Iceland, for example, who are really dependent on their fisheries as a economic sort of source of their economy. And so they're super concerned about changes to ocean currents, changes to fisheries, and impacts that sea ice loss, for example, has on that.
There is another question from Adam, please.
Hi there. Thanks for your talk, James. A quick question. In the kind of this climate policy sphere, some people have talked about climate tipping points. And I kind of have mixed feelings about those as a PhD student studying and learning about these different processes. Obviously, there's uncertainties. But how effective or do you use tipping points when your discussions with politicians and policymakers?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question, I think, because tipping points is such an evocative and powerful term that it's extremely effective in terms of communication. But in some fora, it's kind of taken on a meaning of its own in a way which is different to the perhaps scientific understanding of the term, which can be a problem. And also the other issue with it is that it kind of implies that we're safe until something tips. So the impacts of sort of linear change may not be as important as a tipping point. We do use the terms in the kind of the most scientifically correct way that we can. So it's about kind of managing this. We might talk about ice sheet instabilities, crossing a tipping point, for example, in terms of irreversible retreat. But of course, there are many impacts that will ramp up without the need for a tipping point. Permafrost loss being one, for example. So it's a difficult balancing act, I would say, and it's extremely powerful in terms of a visual communications tool. The media love it. It's very good at impression the general public, but we do have to be careful about being correct and kind of maintaining a scientific integrity about not overusing the term, I would say.
Yeah, and then I
Awesome,
add
thank
on
you.
top of that, I add on top of that with WCRP and the next authors of the IPCC report and a dedicated chapter on tipping point, we are revising all the definition on tipping points because effectively, as James says, sometimes the term tipping points is applied in a different context and means different things, and especially over the different component of the climate systems and the social economical system too, so has different definitions and implies different consequences. So we are trying to revise that consistently through all the scientific communities, just to provide some terminology that is more appropriate in different contexts, basically. So there will be some follow-up. Actually, there is a question by Linda that is asking, are there any opportunities for non-scientists who care about climate change to become involved in COP?
Yeah. Certainly. So I think the first thing I would say is it's not just about the COPs. There are huge numbers of climate weeks going on in different countries throughout the year. And I think they're really important. So a lot of these are key to building momentum that gets fed into the COP. Now, at the COP specifically, there are many ways too. So there are different badges, and there are lots of ways to get involved in terms of civil society, for example, who go and support this. COPs also have a green zone normally, so COPs have a blue zone and a green zone, where the blue zone is where the negotiations take place, and the green zone is open to everyone, allowing you to go in and sort of, yeah, participate in the COP in some way, whereas the blue zone requires a badge. So you have to be badged by an institute or something. But there are so many ways to support the COP also in terms of how to lobby your national governments ahead of these events, how to speak about it in public outreach events as well. But if you were to look at institutions who often provide some support or badges who can bring you to a COP, then it's definitely many ways to get involved, really, then even if you're not a climate or a non-scientist, for example. And in fact, I'd say scientists are generally a minority at a COP. It's mostly politicians, business people, lots of others as well from various segments of society. So it's so important to have scientists there trying to kind of keep the view of science as a way to inform negotiations at a really critical place.
There is another question, like, does ICCF have plans to improve the diversity of its scientific and policy advisory board, and it's seemingly a European focus?
Yep, absolutely. So thanks for that question. We are generally try to be as a multicultural organization spanning different areas, but we do have a particular geographical bias right now, especially because the director is based in Europe and has a background in the US. So this is kind of where this was set up. But we're a small organization, but we see ourselves as a network of people spanning different continents, basically, in different areas of polar science. So we would really welcome people reaching out to us to try and see how they can get involved. And we do regularly do programs. We had a China program over the last 2 years, for example, where we, for 1 year, did a conference in Beijing with the Chinese cryosphere scientists talking about how to talk about policy, and then we brought them to Sweden last year as the part 2 of that conference. So we are continually striving to improve our focus on diversity and welcome people outreaching to us also in terms of getting involved with us too.
Are there any other questions to James? Okay. Well, then I guess we'll thank you very much, James, because it has been great. Thank you for your time, and it was a very clear presentation. I guess I hope it will just enhance and foster people to also participate and engage with science to policy interface, actually, because besides the policy, it's also a different way of doing outreach, as we are all, as scientists, used to make some different kinds of outreach to schools, to other scientific communities, or to public authorities in the towns. But doing this kind of science diplomacy and science to policy is also a very good outreach exercise, actually. And so it's definitely something that is entertaining from many point of views. So it's also something you can get experience out from your own scientific career or your own journalist career or whatever career you are undertaking, actually. So thank you very much, James, and thank you all for attending this workshop. Remind that the recordings will be available on the YouTube channel of Instant by the end of the weekend, I think.
Thanks all. Thanks, Flo.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.